What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. So today, I've got a story that's been sitting in my inbox for months, and honestly, I wasn't sure if I should share it. This one comes from a wildlife biologist. I'm going to call him Dr. Michael Harper to protect his identity. And what happened at his rehabilitation facility in Oregon is something that completely changed how he thinks about animal behavior. We're talking about a black cat that was confiscated from what authorities described as a ritualistic abuse situation. Standard animal rescue, right? Michael had dealt with traumatized animals for over a decade. He knew the protocols, he knew the science, he knew what to expect. But this cat was different. See, Michael started documenting some behavioral patterns that didn't match anything in the literature. We're talking about responses that seemed almost calculated. Like this animal was operating on a level that went way beyond basic conditioning or trauma response. And that's not even the disturbing part. Because when Michael started digging into what actually happened to this cat before the rescue, the things he discovered about the previous owners, the specific rituals this animal had been subjected to, that's what turned a routine rehabilitation case into something that still haunts him today. Now, before we jump in, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We share real stories from scientists and professionals every week. Stories about cases that never made it into official reports. And let me know in the comments if you've ever encountered an animal that just didn't behave the way it should have. I read every single comment. All right, let's get into Dr. Harper's story. My name is Michael Harper. I'm a behavioral biologist, and I've been working with traumatized animals for the better part of 15 years. I run a small rehabilitation facility outside Portland, Oregon. Nothing fancy, just a place where we take in animals that have been through hell and try to give them a second chance. October 2019. That's when everything changed for me. I got a call from the county sheriff's office. They'd raided a property about 40 miles east of the city. Rural place, way off the beaten path. The details were sparse. All they told me was that they'd confiscated several animals during what they called a criminal investigation involving ritual activities. I've heard worse. Trust me, when you work in animal rescue, you see the absolute worst of humanity on a regular basis. Fighting rings, hoarding situations, abuse cases that would make your stomach turn. So when they said ritual activities, I figured I knew what I was dealing with. Probably some backyard sacrifice situation. Terrible, but not uncommon. They brought me 3 animals that day. 2 dogs, German shepherds, severely malnourished but nothing I hadn't handled before. And then there was the cat, male black cat, approximately 2 years old based on his teeth and development. No collar, no microchip. The officer who brought him in, Deputy Morrison, I remember his name, he seemed uncomfortable, more than usual. "This one's been through something," Morrison told me as we transferred the carrier. "Fair warning, Doc. The whole scene where we found them, it wasn't normal." I asked him what he meant by that, but he just shook his head. Said the investigation was ongoing and he couldn't get into specifics. But he did mention one thing that stuck with me. "That cat," he said, pointing at the carrier. "When we found him, he wasn't hiding like the others. He was sitting right in the middle of this setup they had, just sitting there, watching us, like he was waiting." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Animals process trauma differently. Some retreat, some become aggressive, some just shut down completely. I'd seen cats go catatonic after severe abuse. This one was probably just in shock. I should have listened more carefully to what Morrison was trying to tell me. The intake process was standard. Basic physical exam, blood work, fecal sample for parasites. Physically, the cat was in surprisingly good condition. No obvious signs of malnutrition, no external injuries. Coat was actually well maintained. That was my first red flag, though I didn't recognize it at the time. In my experience, animals from abuse situations always show physical signs. Always. Weight loss, poor coat condition, stress-related illnesses, behavioral indicators of pain or fear. This cat showed none of that. His blood work came back clean. Perfect, actually. Better than most house cats I see for routine checkups. I designated him as Subject 7 in my documentation. I was working on a research paper about trauma recovery patterns in domestic cats, and this case seemed like it would provide some interesting data points. I set him up in isolation kennel C4. Standard protocol for new intakes. Quiet space, minimal stimulation, time to decompress and adjust to the new environment. Most cats take 3 to 5 days before they start showing interest in food or human interaction. Subject 7 started eating within 2 hours. Not just eating. He finished his entire meal and was sitting by the kennel door when I came back for evening rounds, looking right at me. Direct eye contact, which most traumatized animals avoid for weeks. "Well, look who's feeling better," I said to him, making notes on his chart. That's when he did something I'd never seen before. He tilted his head to the left, just slightly, like he was considering something. And then he moved to the back corner of his kennel and sat down, facing the wall. Not cowering, not hiding, just positioning himself. I checked his water, made sure his litter box was clean, and moved on to the next animal. But as I was leaving, I glanced back. He had turned around and was watching me leave. Still that same direct eye contact. And I swear, there was something in that look that made me pause. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was assessment, like he was studying me. That night, I went home and told my wife about the new intake, how unusual it was to see such rapid adjustment from an animal that had supposedly been through severe trauma. "Maybe he's just resilient," she said. "Some animals bounce back faster than others." She was right, of course. I'd seen it before, though rarely. Some animals just have a stronger constitution, better coping mechanisms. Maybe Subject 7 was just one of the lucky ones. But as I was falling asleep that night, I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me. That calculated, almost intelligent assessment. In 15 years of working with animals, I'd learned to trust my instincts. And my instincts were telling me that something about this cat wasn't right. I just didn't know how right those instincts were. The next morning, I arrived at the facility around 6 a.m. like always, coffee in hand, ready to start morning rounds and feeding. It's usually the quietest part of my day. Most of the animals are still settling into their routines, and I get a chance to observe their natural behaviors without too much stimulation. Subject 7 was awake when I approached his kennel. Not just awake, alert, sitting in what I can only describe as perfect posture, directly facing the kennel door, like he'd been waiting for me. His positioning was deliberate, calculated in a way that immediately caught my attention. Most rescue cats spend their first few days hiding in the back corners of their kennels. "Morning, buddy," I said, checking his food bowl from the night before. Empty, completely clean. Even the water bowl had been drained. That was unusual. Most cats, especially traumatized ones, are grazers. They'll pick at their food throughout the day, leave some for later. It's a survival instinct. But Subject 7 had consumed everything within hours of it being provided. I refilled his bowls and started taking behavioral notes. This was day 2 of what I expected would be a several-week rehabilitation process. Day 2, Subject 7, I spoke into my recorder. Animal appears alert and responsive. Maintained eye contact for approximately 15 seconds during morning check. No signs of fear-based responses. Food consumption complete within 12-hour period. As I was speaking, something caught my attention. The cat had moved. Not dramatically, just shifted position slightly. But he'd moved in response to my voice. Not toward the back of the kennel like most frightened animals would. He'd moved closer to the front. I stopped recording and crouched down to his eye level. "Hey there, how you doing?" Subject 7 tilted his head again. That same deliberate movement I'd noticed the day before. But this time he followed it up with something that made me pause my entire morning routine. He chirped. Not a meow. Not a typical cat vocalization. A chirp. Short, almost conversational. Like he was responding to my question. I made a mental note to review the literature on post-trauma vocalizations in cats. Maybe this was a stress response I wasn't familiar with, but it felt more like communication than distress. Around 10 a.m., my assistant Jenny arrived. Jenny's been working with me for about 3 years. She's got a natural way with animals, especially the difficult cases. If anyone could help Subject 7 adjust to human contact, it would be her. "Want to meet our new intake?" I asked as she was hanging up her coat. We walked over to Kennel C4 together. Subject 7 was in the same position as before, alert, facing forward, sitting with perfect posture. "Oh, wow," Jenny said immediately. "He's beautiful. Look at that coat." She was right. His fur was completely black, thick and glossy. "What's his story?" she asked, crouching down to his level. confiscated from some kind of ritual abuse case. That's about all I know right now. Jenny extended her hand toward the kennel, fingers slightly curled, letting Subject 7 approach on his own terms. Standard protocol for building trust with traumatized animals. Subject 7 looked at her hand, then he looked at her face, then he looked at me. The sequence felt deliberate, like he was assessing each of us individually, and then he did something that made both of us freeze. He stood up, walked directly to the front of the kennel, and rubbed his head against the bars where Jenny's hand was positioned. Immediate, direct, physical contact. No hesitation, no fear response, no gradual approach. Just trust. "That's not normal," Jenny said quietly, not moving her hand. Subject 7 continued rubbing against the bars, purring now. In all my years working with rescue animals, I'd never seen an abused animal show immediate trust like that. It takes weeks, sometimes months, for them to allow physical contact. The fact that he was not only allowing it, but actively seeking it out, was completely unprecedented in my experience. Maybe he wasn't actually abused, Jenny suggested. Maybe he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a logical explanation. Sometimes animals get caught up in situations they're not actually part of. Maybe Subject 7 was just a stray who happened to be on the property when the raid occurred. But that didn't explain the deputy's comments about the setup and the cat sitting in the middle of it, watching. I decided to try something. I reached for the kennel latch. Jenny immediately stepped back. "Michael, are you sure that's wise? He's only been here one day." I paused with my hand on the latch. She was right to be cautious. Standard protocol dictated at least a week of observation before attempting direct contact with trauma cases. But everything about this cat defied standard protocol. His behavior, his physical condition, his immediate trust. None of it matched what I knew about animal psychology. I opened the kennel door halfway and waited. Subject 7 looked at the opening, then at me, then at Jenny. And then he did something that should have been my biggest warning sign. He stepped out of the kennel calmly, sat down directly in front of me, and looked up, waiting, like he was asking permission for what came next. By day 5, I had filled 3 pages of behavioral notes on Subject 7, and none of it made sense according to everything I knew about animal psychology. He had established what I can only describe as a routine that was far too sophisticated for a traumatized rescue animal. Every morning at exactly 6:15 a.m., he would position himself at the front of his kennel, sitting in perfect posture, facing the door. Not approximate timing, exact timing. I tested this by arriving at different hours throughout the week. 6 a.m., 6:30, even 7 a.m. on one occasion. It didn't matter. At 6:15, he would move to that position and wait, like he had developed an internal clock specifically calibrated to my arrival pattern. This level of behavioral adaptation typically takes weeks or months to establish. The food consumption patterns were equally unusual. Most cats eat sporadically throughout the day, particularly those recovering from stressful situations. Subject 7 would wait until I placed his food bowl in the kennel, make direct eye contact with me, and then begin eating. He would finish the entire meal in under 10 minutes, then return to his sitting position facing the door. Never left scraps, never saved food for later, never showed any of the hoarding behaviors typical of animals who had experienced food insecurity. It was like he was operating on a completely different set of survival instincts. Jenny started joking that he was more disciplined than most people she knew. I wasn't finding it funny anymore. The vocalization patterns were what really started to concern me. Subject 7 had developed what I can only describe as a repertoire of sounds that seemed specifically designed for different situations and people. With me, it was always that short chirp, almost like acknowledgement. With Jenny, he would make a softer, longer trill. With our part-time volunteer Sarah, who came in on weekends, he would make a completely different sound, a low, rumbling purr that seemed to start before she even entered the room. I had never documented such specific person-targeted vocalizations in cats. It suggested a level of social sophistication that went far beyond normal feline behavior. These weren't random stress responses. They were calculated, purposeful communications. What disturbed me most was his response to our other animals. The 2 German shepherds from the same confiscation were housed in kennels about 15 feet away from Subject 7. They were progressing normally through their recovery. Initially fearful, gradually becoming more trusting, showing typical signs of improvement. But whenever they became agitated or stressed, Subject 7 would position himself at the front of his kennel and stare directly at them. Not casual observation. Intense, focused attention. And within minutes, the dogs would calm down. Every single time. I started timing these interactions. The average duration from the dogs showing distress to complete calm was 4 minutes and 30 seconds. This happened consistently over a 2-week period. I decided to document these interactions more systematically. I set up a camera focused on Subject 7's kennel and another on the dog's area. What I captured over the next week challenged everything I thought I knew about interspecies communication. The footage showed Subject 7 responding to the dog's stress signals before they became audibly agitated. He would move to his observation position up to 30 seconds before the dogs showed any obvious signs of distress. Somehow, he was detecting their emotional state changes before they became apparent to human observers. The implications of this kind of predictive behavior were staggering. I had never seen anything like it in the scientific literature. The most unsettling pattern emerged during his interactions with visitors. We occasionally had potential adopters come through the facility, and Subject 7's responses to different people were unnervingly specific. With some visitors, he would remain calm and approachable. With others, he would retreat to the back corner of his kennel and refuse to make eye contact. But with a few people, maybe 1 in every 10 or 12 visitors, his behavior would become something I can only describe as hostile, not aggressive in a typical cat way. He wouldn't hiss or arch his back. Instead, he would position himself directly facing the person and stare with an intensity that made everyone uncomfortable. Several potential adopters commented on feeling unsettled by his gaze. I started keeping detailed notes on the visitors who triggered this response. Initially, I thought it might be related to scent. Maybe they had other animals at home, or were wearing cologne that reminded him of his previous situation. But after reviewing my notes, I realized there was no obvious pattern. The people he reacted negatively to came from different backgrounds, wore different scents, and had varying levels of experience with animals. The only commonality was his immediate, intense negative response. It was like he was evaluating something about these individuals that wasn't apparent to anyone else. Jenny started calling it his people screening system. I was beginning to think she wasn't entirely joking. The breaking point came during week 3 when I brought in Dr. Patricia Reeves, a consulting veterinary behaviorist, to get a second opinion on Subject 7's case. Dr. Reeves had over 20 years of experience with difficult animals and had published extensively on trauma recovery in domestic cats. I was hoping she could help me understand what I was observing and provide some guidance on appropriate treatment protocols. When I introduced her to Subject 7, his reaction was immediate and intense. He moved to the back corner of his kennel, crouched low, and began making a sound I had never heard before. A low, continuous growling that seemed to vibrate through the entire kennel structure. Dr. Reeves tried to approach calmly, using all the proper techniques for fearful animals. Subject 7's response only intensified. After about 10 minutes, Dr. Reeves stepped away from the kennel and looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. "Michael, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Are you absolutely certain about this animal's background? Because what I'm seeing here isn't consistent with any trauma response I've encountered in my career. This cat isn't behaving like an abuse victim. He's behaving like he's protecting himself from a specific threat. And somehow, he's identified me as that threat within seconds of meeting me." She paused and glanced back at Subject 7, who was still maintaining his defensive posture. "There's something about this case that doesn't add up. I think you need to dig deeper into what really happened before he came here." The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning in November, about a month after Subject 7 arrived at our facility. Jenny was cleaning the kennels in the cat wing when she slipped and fell hard on her left wrist. I heard her cry out from my office and rushed to help her. She was sitting on the floor, holding her wrist, clearly in pain. But what struck me as odd was Subject 7's reaction to the situation. While every other animal in the facility was either cowering or showing agitation from Jenny's distress call, Subject 7 was sitting calmly at the front of his kennel, watching the scene unfold with what I can only describe as detached interest. Not concern, not fear, not even curiosity, just observation. Like he was studying our response to the emergency rather than reacting to it. Jenny ended up with a fractured wrist and was out for 2 weeks. During her absence, I hired a temporary assistant named Marcus to help with daily operations. Marcus was experienced with animal care and came with excellent references from 3 other veterinary facilities. On his second day, while feeding the animals in the cat wing, he dropped an entire case of canned food. 24 cans scattered across the floor, creating a tremendous noise that sent most of the animals into a panic, except Subject 7. Again, he simply watched from his kennel with that same calm, observational demeanor. But what bothered me was the timing. Marcus later told me that just before the case slipped from his hands, he had felt an unusual sensation, like someone was staring at him intensely. When he looked up, Subject 7 was focused directly on him. The third incident occurred the following week, when our weekend volunteer, Sarah, was working alone at the facility. She called me at home around noon, clearly shaken. She had been moving a heavy bag of dog food from storage when the dolly she was using suddenly collapsed, causing the 50-pound bag to fall and nearly crush her foot. She managed to jump back just in time, but she was rattled by how close she had come to serious injury. When I asked her to describe what happened leading up to the accident, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She said that right before the dolly collapsed, she had glanced over at Subject 7's kennel and found him staring directly at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She actually looked away and lost focus on what she was doing. I started reviewing these incidents more systematically and realized there was a disturbing pattern emerging. Each accident had occurred while the person was in direct line of sight of Subject 7's kennel. Each person reported feeling like they were being watched intensely just before their accident occurred. And in each case, Subject 7's reaction to the actual incident was unnaturally calm, almost like he had been expecting it to happen. I tried to rationalize these observations. Correlation doesn't equal causation. These could easily be coincidences. People working around animals have accidents all the time. The feeling of being watched could be explained by normal hypervigilance around a new, potentially unpredictable animal. But my scientific training was warring with my instincts, and my instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. The fourth incident was the one that made me start questioning my own sanity. Dr. Amanda Torres, our consulting veterinarian, came in to perform routine health checks on all our animals. She's worked with us for over 5 years and knows our facility like the back of her hand. While examining one of the German shepherds, she somehow managed to inject herself with the sedative she was preparing for the dog, a significant dose that required immediate medical attention and a trip to the emergency room. Dr. Torres is one of the most careful, experienced veterinarians I know. In 5 years of working together, I had never seen her make even a minor procedural error. But somehow, while Subject 7 was watching from his kennel 15 feet away, she made a mistake that could have been fatal. When Dr. Torres returned to work a few days later, I asked her about what happened. She couldn't explain it. She remembered preparing the injection, remembered approaching the dog, and then everything became fuzzy. She said she felt distracted, like her attention was being pulled away from her work. When I asked if she remembered anything specific about feeling distracted, she mentioned that she had been aware of Subject 7 watching her throughout the examination. She said his stare was so intense that she found herself glancing over at his kennel repeatedly, breaking her normal concentration. "It's probably nothing," she said, "but that cat has a very unsettling presence. I can't explain it better than that." She recommended that we keep his kennel covered during future veterinary procedures to minimize distractions. I implemented Dr. Torres's suggestion immediately, but it led to an unexpected problem. Whenever we covered Subject 7's kennel, the other animals in the facility became noticeably agitated. The dogs would whine and pace, the cats would hide in the back corners of their kennels, and our rabbit would refuse to eat. It was like the other animals were more disturbed by not being able to see Subject 7 than they were by his presence. This created an impossible situation. Covering his kennel distressed the other animals, but leaving it uncovered seemed to coincide with accidents and injuries among the staff. I felt like I was being forced to choose between the well-being of my animals and the safety of my team. This was not a decision I had ever expected to face in my career. By December, I had documented 7 separate incidents involving staff members being injured or making dangerous mistakes while in the vicinity of Subject 7's kennel. The statistical probability of this being coincidental was becoming vanishingly small, but the alternative explanation, that somehow this cat was influencing human behavior in ways that led to accidents, was scientifically impossible. I found myself in the uncomfortable position of having to choose between accepting an explanation that defied everything I knew about animal behavior or continuing to put my staff at risk. Neither option was acceptable. I needed answers, and I needed them before someone got seriously hurt. That's when I decided to contact Deputy Morrison and find out exactly what had happened at that rural property where Subject 7 was found. The phone call I made that evening would change everything I thought I knew about this case. Deputy Morrison was reluctant to discuss the details at first, citing the ongoing investigation. But when I explained the pattern of incidents at my facility, his tone shifted dramatically. "Dr. Harper," he said finally, "I think we need to have a face-to-face conversation about what we found at that property. There are things about this case that, well, they didn't make it into the official reports. Things that the department decided were better left undocumented. Can you meet me tomorrow?" I agreed immediately. I had no idea that this conversation would lead me down a path that would fundamentally challenge my understanding of the natural world. The next evening, I met Deputy Morrison at a small diner about 20 miles outside of town. He looked tired, older than I remembered from our first meeting 2 months ago. When I arrived, he was already sitting in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out the window. As I approached, he glanced up with an expression that immediately told me this conversation was going to be more serious than I had anticipated. "Dr. Harper, thanks for coming. I've been thinking about this case every day since we closed the investigation. What you told me on the phone about the incidents at your facility, it doesn't surprise me. Not after what we saw out there." He gestured for me to sit down, then looked around the diner to make sure we weren't being overheard. "The property where we found your cat belonged to a man named Vincent Kellerman," Morrison began, his voice low and measured. 63 years old, lived alone for the past 15 years. Neighbors described him as a recluse who kept to himself and rarely came into town except for supplies. The call that led us to the property came from a postal worker who noticed mail piling up for over 2 weeks. When we went to do a wellness check, we found Kellerman dead in his living room. Natural causes, apparently. Heart attack. But the scene around him, that's where things got complicated. He paused to take a sip of coffee, and I could see his hands trembling slightly. Whatever he was about to tell me, it was clearly affecting him more than he wanted to admit. "The living room had been converted into some kind of ritual space," he continued. "Symbols carved into the wooden floor, candles arranged in specific patterns, books on occult practices stacked everywhere. The coroner estimated Kellerman had been dead for at least 10 days when we found him. But here's the thing that still bothers me. That black cat of yours was sitting right in the center of the room, completely healthy and calm. No signs of hunger or distress, despite having no access to food or water for over a week. The other animals we found were in various states of malnutrition and dehydration, but your cat looked like he'd been fed and cared for the entire time." Morrison met my eyes across the table. "How does an animal survive 10 days with no food or water and come out looking better than when it went in?" I felt a chill run down my spine. The implications of what Morrison was describing were impossible, but I couldn't dismiss them given what I had observed at my facility. "You said there were books on occult practices. Did you catalog what kinds of rituals Kellerman was involved in?" Morrison nodded grimly. "That's where it gets really disturbing. Most of the books focused on something called familiar binding, rituals designed to create supernatural connections between humans and animals. According to the literature we found, Kellerman believed he could transfer aspects of his consciousness into an animal companion. The cat was apparently the subject of these rituals for several years." He pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. "We found detailed records going back 3 years. Feeding schedules, ritual dates, behavioral observations. Kellerman was documenting the cat's responses to various procedures and ceremonies." "What kinds of procedures?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Morrison's expression darkened. "Blood rituals, mostly. Small amounts taken from both Kellerman and the cat, then mixed during specific lunar phases. Meditation sessions where Kellerman would stare into the cat's eyes for hours at a time, trying to establish what he called psychic connection. And fasting periods where both he and the cat would go without food for days, supposedly to weaken the boundaries between their consciousness. And stranger things, rituals involving the cat being present during Kellerman's interactions with other people. Like the cat was somehow evaluating or judging them." Morrison closed the notebook and looked directly at me. "Dr. Harper, I'm not saying I believe in any of this supernatural nonsense, but I am saying that this man spent 3 years trying to create some kind of unnatural bond with that animal. The pieces were starting to form a terrifying picture in my mind. Subject 7's ability to evaluate people, his calm response to emergency situations, his apparent influence on both animals and humans. Could these behaviors somehow be connected to whatever Kellerman had done to him? Did you find any evidence that the rituals were actually affecting the cat's behavior? Morrison laughed bitterly. That's the question that's been keeping me awake at night. According to Kellerman's notes, the cat started showing enhanced abilities about 18 months ago. Better ability to read human emotions, stronger influence over other animals, what Kellerman described as protective instincts toward people he deemed threatening. Kellerman believed the cat was developing the ability to sense people's intentions and react accordingly. He leaned forward across the table. Dr. Harper, I've been a cop for 22 years. I've seen every kind of crazy you can imagine, but the way that cat looked at us during the raid, it was like he understood exactly what was happening and why we were there. There's something else, Morrison continued, his voice dropping even lower. We found journals detailing Kellerman's interactions with visitors over the past year. Anyone who came to the property, delivery drivers, utility workers, neighbors. Kellerman would document how the cat reacted to them. People the cat seemed to like were welcomed back. People the cat reacted negatively to, well, they tended to have accidents on the property. Slip and fall injuries, equipment malfunctions, sudden illness. Kellerman started to believe the cat was protecting him by influencing these people. Morrison pulled out his phone and showed me photos of several journal pages. The handwriting was meticulous, almost obsessive. Dates, times, detailed descriptions of the cat's behavior toward specific individuals, and corresponding reports of accidents or mishaps. The pattern was undeniable and absolutely chilling. I stared at the photos in shock. The similarities between Kellerman's observations and what was happening at my facility were too precise to be coincidental. Morrison, why didn't any of this make it into the official reports? He sighed heavily. Because who would believe it? A dead recluse who thought he was conducting supernatural experiments on his pet cat. The department decided it was the delusional ravings of a mentally unstable individual. We cataloged the evidence, but the case was closed as death by natural causes with no criminal activity. The animals were released to rescue facilities, and everyone wanted to forget about the whole situation. Morrison finished his coffee and looked at me intently. But after hearing about what's happening at your place, I'm starting to think maybe Kellerman wasn't as delusional as we assumed. As I drove home that night, my mind was racing with the implications of Morrison's revelations. If even a fraction of what Kellerman believed was true, then I had been housing an animal that was potentially dangerous to everyone around him. But the scientist in me still rejected the supernatural explanations. There had to be a rational explanation for Subject 7's behavior, some form of conditioning or learned response that could account for his unusual abilities. However, I could no longer ignore the mounting evidence that this cat was somehow connected to the accidents and injuries at my facility. I had a responsibility to my staff and to the other animals in my care. Something had to be done, but I had no idea what that something should be. The next morning, I would have to make one of the most difficult decisions of my career. When I arrived at the facility the morning after my meeting with Deputy Morrison, I found my staff huddled together in the break room, clearly shaken. Jenny, whose wrist had finally healed enough for her to return to work, looked up at me with genuine fear in her eyes. Michael, something happened last night. Sarah was here late doing the evening feeding and... She paused, struggling to find the right words. She called me around 9 p.m. crying. Said she couldn't finish her rounds because every time she got near the cat wing, she felt like something was watching her. Not just watching, studying her. Like it was planning something. Jenny glanced toward the direction of Subject 7's kennel. She said she could feel his eyes on her even when she wasn't looking directly at his kennel. Sarah's been working with animals for 10 years, Michael. She's not someone who scares easily. I walked over to the cat wing to check on Subject 7, and what I found made my blood run cold. Every single cat in the wing was pressed against the back walls of their kennels, as far away from Subject 7 as possible. These were cats who had been recovering well, showing normal social behaviors and preparing for adoption. Now, they were exhibiting extreme fear responses, refusing to make eye contact with me, and trembling visibly. But Subject 7 was sitting in his usual position at the front of his kennel, completely calm, watching my every movement with that familiar calculating gaze. The contrast between his composure and the terror of every other animal in the room was stark and deeply unsettling. It was like he was feeding off their fear, drawing strength from their distress. Over the next few days, the situation continued to deteriorate rapidly. Our part-time volunteer Marcus refused to work alone in the building anymore, citing an overwhelming feeling of being watched whenever he was near the cat wing. Dr. Torres cancelled her weekly visit, claiming she had developed an inexplicable anxiety about returning to our facility. 3 potential adopters, who had shown interest in other animals, left abruptly after brief visits, all mentioning feeling uncomfortable or unwelcome during their tours. We were losing staff, volunteers, and potential homes for our animals because of one cat's presence. But the most disturbing development was the change in behavior among our other rescue animals. They were regressing, showing signs of stress and trauma that contradicted months of successful rehabilitation. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when I witnessed something that forced me to confront the reality I had been trying to deny. I was in my office reviewing adoption applications when I heard Jenny scream from the cat wing. I rushed to find her standing frozen in front of Subject 7's kennel, staring at him with a mixture of terror and confusion. "He's in my head," she whispered without looking away from the cat. "I can feel him in my thoughts. He's showing me things that haven't happened yet." I followed her gaze to Subject 7, who was sitting perfectly still, maintaining direct eye contact with Jenny. His pupils were dilated despite the bright lighting, and there was something in his expression that I had never seen before, a kind of predatory intelligence that seemed entirely uncat-like. Jenny remained frozen for another 30 seconds before suddenly snapping back to awareness, gasping as if she had been holding her breath. When I asked Jenny to describe what she had experienced, her account chilled me to the bone. She said that while maintaining eye contact with Subject 7, she had seen vivid images of herself having accidents around the facility, falling down stairs that didn't exist in our building, being attacked by animals that were normally docile, finding herself trapped in rooms with no way out. "It wasn't like dreaming," she explained, still visibly shaken. "It was like he was showing me possibilities, ways that I could be hurt if I didn't." She paused, struggling to articulate what she meant. "If I didn't respect him. That's the only way I can describe it. Like he was demonstrating his power to harm me, but also showing restraint. Like he was giving me a choice." I had Jenny sit down while I called our emergency veterinarian to report what seemed like a possible psychological break, but she insisted she felt fine now that she was away from the cat's direct gaze. The incident with Jenny was the catalyst I needed to take decisive action, but it also presented me with an impossible dilemma. I contacted Dr. Patricia Reeves again, hoping her expertise in animal behavior could provide some guidance on how to handle this situation safely. When I described the recent incidents, including Jenny's experience, Dr. Reeves was silent for a long moment before responding. "Michael, what you're describing goes beyond anything in my professional experience. If this animal is somehow capable of influencing human consciousness or behavior, then he represents a danger not just to your staff, but potentially to anyone who comes into contact with him. However, we have no established protocols for dealing with an animal that exhibits these kinds of abilities. We're in completely uncharted territory." Her recommendation was both logical and heartbreaking: immediate euthanasia to prevent further harm. The suggestion of euthanasia created an ethical crisis that kept me awake for 3 straight nights. Subject 7 had never shown direct aggression toward humans or animals. He had never bitten, scratched, or physically harmed anyone in our care. According to traditional animal behavior standards, he would be considered a model resident, calm, clean, responsive to human interaction. The idea of ending his life based on a series of accidents and subjective experiences felt like a betrayal of everything I believed about animal welfare. But I also had a responsibility to protect my staff, my volunteers, and the other animals under my care. If Subject 7 was somehow responsible for the pattern of incidents we had experienced, then keeping him meant accepting that more people would likely be hurt. The weight of this decision was crushing, made worse by the fact that I had no scientific framework for understanding what I was dealing with. I decided to give myself 1 more week to find an alternative solution. I contacted every animal behavior expert, veterinary behaviorist, and research facility I could find, looking for someone who might have experience with similar cases or could offer guidance on how to proceed. The responses I received were universally baffling. Several experts suggested that what I was describing was impossible and recommended psychological evaluation for my staff. Others acknowledged that animal behavior can sometimes appear to influence human behavior in subtle ways, but insisted that direct mental manipulation was scientifically impossible. One researcher from a university in Colorado mentioned off the record that they had received similar reports from other facilities, but that no official studies had been conducted due to the lack of measurable, replicable phenomena. Nobody could offer me a solution that didn't involve either accepting ongoing risk or destroying an animal that might be innocent. By the end of that week, I had reached a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my career. The safety of my staff and the well-being of the other animals in my care had to take precedence over my personal feelings about Subject 7. I scheduled an appointment with our veterinarian for the following Monday morning, planning to have Subject 7 humanely euthanized before the facility opened and other staff members arrived. I would take full responsibility for the decision and handle the procedure personally to minimize the psychological impact on my team. But as I was preparing to leave the facility that Friday evening, I made one final visit to Subject 7's kennel to say goodbye. What happened during that visit would change everything once again, forcing me to confront possibilities I had never imagined, and ultimately leading to a resolution I could never have predicted. That Friday evening, I stood alone in the cat wing facing Subject 7's kennel, knowing this would be our final interaction. The facility was empty except for the two of us. All the other animals had been moved to a different wing after the incident with Jenny. I had spent the entire week agonizing over this decision, weighing my ethical obligations as a biologist against my responsibility to protect the people and animals under my care. As I approached his kennel, Subject 7 was sitting in his familiar position, but something was different. For the first time since his arrival, he wasn't making direct eye contact with me. Instead, he was staring at something behind me, his pupils dilated, and his body tense with what appeared to be genuine fear. I turned around to see what had captured his attention, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back, he was focused on me again, but his expression had changed completely. For the first time in months, Subject 7 looked like a normal, frightened cat. His ears were flattened against his head, his body was pressed low against the floor of his kennel, and he was making soft, distressed vocalizations that sounded nothing like the calculated chirps and trills I had documented throughout his stay. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that I questioned whether I was looking at the same animal. I crouched down to his eye level and spoke softly to him, using the same gentle tone I employed with genuinely traumatized animals.
"Hey there, buddy. What's wrong?" His response was immediate and heartbreaking. He approached the front of his kennel and pressed his head against the bars, seeking comfort in a way that seemed entirely natural and desperate. This wasn't the calculating, predatory intelligence I had observed for weeks. This was a scared animal seeking reassurance from a human caregiver. As I reached through the bars to gently stroke his head, something extraordinary happened.
For just a moment, I experienced what I can only describe as a flash of shared consciousness. I saw brief, fragmented images that weren't my own memories. A man's face contorted with obsessive intensity, hands performing repetitive motions over candlelit symbols, hours of forced eye contact that felt like psychological violation. The images were accompanied by emotions that clearly weren't mine: confusion, fear, and a desperate desire to escape from something that had been forced upon him against his will. The experience lasted only seconds, but it was vivid enough to completely change my understanding of Subject 7's situation. He wasn't a supernatural threat or a malevolent entity. He was a victim who had been subjected to months or years of psychological manipulation and conditioning that had fundamentally altered his behavior in ways neither he nor I fully understood. The realization that Subject 7 might be as much a victim as anyone else created a new ethical dilemma that I was completely unprepared to handle. If Kellerman's rituals had somehow conditioned this cat to exhibit the behaviors I had observed, then euthanizing him would be equivalent to killing an animal for being abused. But if those same conditioning effects were causing ongoing harm to my staff and other animals, I still had a responsibility to prevent further incidents. I spent the next hour sitting on the floor in front of his kennel, watching him exhibit completely normal cat behaviors, grooming himself, curling up for a nap, responding positively to gentle verbal interaction. It was like observing two completely different animals occupying the same body, depending on some unknown trigger that determined which version of his personality was dominant at any given moment. The scientific part of my mind was fascinated by the implications, but the practical side was terrified of making the wrong choice. I made a decision that went against every protocol and safety measure I had established. I opened Subject 7's kennel and allowed him to come out into the hallway under my direct supervision. My reasoning was that if I was going to end his life on Monday, he deserved a few hours of freedom to experience normal movement and exploration. What happened next convinced me that my original assessment of the situation had been incomplete and potentially completely wrong. Subject 7 stepped out of his kennel cautiously, sniffing the air and examining his surroundings with the curiosity of a normal cat exploring a new environment. He showed no signs of the calculated, predatory behavior I had documented for weeks. Instead, he rubbed against my legs, purred when I petted him, and even played briefly with a small toy I offered him. For 30 minutes, he was simply a cat being a cat. Then something shifted, and I witnessed the transformation that had been occurring throughout his stay at our facility. Subject 7 suddenly stopped playing and moved to a specific spot in the hallway where he sat down and stared intently at the wall. His posture changed to that familiar, unnaturally perfect sitting position, and his expression became focused and calculating. The change was so abrupt and complete that it was like watching one animal possession replace another. Within seconds, he had returned to the behavioral patterns that had been causing problems, but now I understood that this wasn't his state. It was a conditioned response to something I couldn't. The question was whether this conditioning reversed, or if it was now a permanent part of his psychological. I spent the weekend researching everything I could find about psychological conditioning in animals, particularly techniques that might have been used in occult or ritualistic contexts. What I discovered was both enlightening and disturbing. There were documented cases of animals being subjected to intensive behavioral modification through repetitive rituals, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation. Some of these techniques had been studied in laboratory settings and were known to create lasting changes in animal behavior, including increased sensitivity to human emotional states and altered social responses. The effects were often irreversible, but some research suggested that providing a completely different environment and removing all triggers associated with the original conditioning might allow an animal to revert to more natural behaviors over time. This gave me hope that Subject 7 might be recoverable with the right approach. By Sunday evening, I had developed a plan that represented a compromise between my ethical obligations and practical concerns. Rather than euthanizing Subject 7, I would transfer him to a specialized facility that dealt with animals requiring long-term behavioral rehabilitation. I contacted Dr. Amanda Richardson, who ran a private sanctuary for animals with severe behavioral issues about 300 miles north of our location. Dr. Richardson had experience with animals that exhibited unusual or problematic behaviors due to abuse, neglect, or improper training. When I explained Subject 7's case in detail, including both the concerning incidents and my recent observations about his dual behavioral patterns, she agreed to take him with the understanding that he might never be suitable for adoption, but could live out his natural life in a secure, controlled environment where his presence wouldn't endanger other people or animals. The transfer was scheduled for Monday morning, which meant I had to inform my staff about the change in plans without explaining all the details that had led to my decision. I called an emergency meeting and explained that Subject 7 was being transferred to a specialized facility that was better equipped to handle his unique behavioral needs. Jenny looked relieved, Marcus nodded approvingly, and Dr. Torres expressed cautious optimism that this solution would allow our facility to return to normal operations while ensuring that Subject 7 received appropriate care. But as I was preparing the paperwork for his transfer, I received a phone call that would force me to confront one final, unexpected aspect of this case. Dr. Richardson called to inform me that during the night, 3 other animals at her facility had died suddenly and without explanation, and she was no longer able to accept new intakes until she could determine what had happened. Subject 7 would have to stay with us indefinitely. The news that Dr. Richardson's facility could no longer take Subject 7 left me facing the same impossible decision I thought I had resolved. Monday morning arrived with no alternative placement options, no clear understanding of what was causing his behavioral anomalies, and a growing sense that I was running out of time before something catastrophic happened at our facility. I arrived early to find that the other animals we had moved to the separate wing were refusing to eat and showing signs of extreme distress, even though they were physically separated from Subject 7 by nearly 50 feet and 2 closed doors. It was as if his presence was affecting the entire building regardless of proximity, creating an atmosphere of tension and fear that was palpable to every living creature, except humans. I realized that the problem wasn't going to be solved by physical distance or environmental changes. There was something fundamentally different about this animal that made him incompatible with normal rescue operations. That morning, I made the most difficult decision of my career. I called our veterinarian and scheduled the euthanasia procedure for that afternoon, understanding that I would have to live with the moral weight of ending the life of an animal that was as much a victim as anyone else. But as I was preparing the necessary paperwork, Subject 7 exhibited a behavior that stopped me in my tracks. When I approached his kennel to take final measurements for the documentation, he looked directly at me and began making a vocalization I had never heard from him before. A soft, mournful sound that was unmistakably communicative. Not the calculated chirps or territorial growling I had documented, but something that sounded remarkably like pleading. For the first time since his arrival, I had the clear impression that he understood what was happening and was asking me to reconsider. I postponed the procedure by 24 hours and spent that Tuesday night alone at the facility, observing Subject 7 continuously to see if I could identify what triggered his behavioral transitions. What I discovered fundamentally changed my understanding of his condition and led to an unexpected resolution. During the hours between midnight and dawn, Subject 7 exhibited completely normal cat behavior, sleeping naturally, responding positively to gentle interaction, showing curiosity about his environment without any of the predatory calculation I had observed during daylight hours. The transformation occurred precisely at sunrise, when his demeanor shifted back to the controlled observational state that had characterized most of his stay with us. This pattern suggested that his conditioning was tied to circadian rhythms or specific environmental cues that were stronger during daylight hours. Armed with this new information, I contacted Dr. Maria Santos, a researcher at UC Davis who specialized in circadian behavioral patterns in domestic animals. When I described Subject 7's case, including the day-night behavioral variations, she immediately expressed interest in studying him as part of a research project on trauma-induced behavioral cycling in rescue animals. Dr. Santos explained that severe psychological conditioning could sometimes create behaviors that were triggered by environmental factors like light exposure, temperature changes, or even electromagnetic fields. She offered to take Subject 7 as a research subject, with the understanding that he would be housed in a controlled laboratory environment where his behavioral patterns could be studied safely while ensuring he received proper care for the remainder of his natural life. The transfer to Dr. Santos's research facility took place the following Thursday. As we loaded Subject 7 into the specialized transport carrier, he looked at me one final time with an expression that seemed remarkably like gratitude. Not the calculating assessment I had grown accustomed to, but genuine appreciation from an animal who somehow understood that he was being given another chance at life. Dr. Santos later reported that in the controlled laboratory environment, with carefully managed lighting and minimal human contact during specific hours, Subject 7's problematic behaviors diminished significantly. He became part of a long-term study on behavioral conditioning reversal, contributing to research that might eventually help other animals who had been subjected to similar abuse. The aftermath of Subject 7's departure revealed the extent to which his presence had affected our facility. Within days, the other animals returned to normal behavior patterns. Our staff regained their confidence and enthusiasm for their work, and we were able to resume normal operations without the undercurrent of tension that had characterized the previous months. Jenny stopped having nightmares about work, Marcus returned to his usual cheerful demeanor, and Dr. Torres resumed her regular visits without any signs of the anxiety that had plagued her during Subject 7's stay. The statistical correlation between his presence and the series of accidents and incidents at our facility became undeniable in retrospect, though I still couldn't explain the mechanism by which one small cat had managed to influence the behavior of both humans and animals throughout an entire building. The experience fundamentally changed how I approach animal rescue and rehabilitation. I learned that our scientific understanding of animal psychology and behavior is far more limited than I had previously believed, and that there are aspects of the human-animal relationship that can't be easily explained through conventional research methodologies. I also learned that sometimes the most ethical decision isn't the one that aligns with our personal feelings or professional training, but the one that prioritizes the safety and well-being of all the individuals involved. Subject 7's case taught me that being a responsible biologist sometimes means accepting that there are phenomena we don't understand and making difficult decisions based on observed outcomes rather than theoretical knowledge. Dr. Santos continues to update me on Subject 7's progress, now nearly 2 years after his transfer to the research facility. According to her reports, he has adapted well to the controlled environment and shows minimal signs of the problematic behaviors that characterized his time with us. He has become a valuable research subject, contributing to studies that have already led to improved protocols for rehabilitating animals that have been subjected to psychological abuse or conditioning. While he will never be suitable for adoption into a normal home environment, he is living comfortably and safely while helping scientists better understand the complex ways in which trauma can manifest in animal behavior. His story serves as a reminder that animal rescue work sometimes involves cases that challenge our assumptions and force us to expand our understanding of what's possible. Looking back on this experience, I realized that Subject 7 wasn't evil or supernatural. He was simply an animal who had been changed by circumstances beyond his control and was struggling to exist in a world that didn't understand his condition. The real tragedy wasn't the strange behaviors he exhibited, but the months or years of psychological manipulation he endured before coming into our care.
His case taught me that effective animal welfare sometimes requires accepting uncomfortable truths about the limits of our knowledge and the complexity of recovery from severe trauma. Every animal that comes through our facility now receives more comprehensive behavioral evaluation, and we have protocols in place for identifying and managing cases that might present unusual challenges.
Subject 7's legacy is a deeper understanding of animal psychology and a commitment to approaching each rescue case with greater nuance and awareness of the unexpected ways that trauma can manifest in animal behavior.